And we are no longer just relying on the strength of our values, but also the value of our strength. We are building that strength at home. Since my government took office, we have cut taxes on incomes, on capital gains, and business investment. We have removed all federal barriers to interprovincial trade. We are fast-tracking $1 trillion of investments in energy, AI, critical minerals, new trade corridors, and beyond. We're doubling our defense spending by the end of this decade, and we're doing so in ways that build our domestic industries.
Let's talk about a 1% wealth tax on the 1%.
Not wealth.
Yeah, wealth tax.
No, that's way too much.
So if you're worth $7.3 million or more, you're going to pay 1% of your wealth.
1% of the wealth
generate
is crazy.
$3 billion a year, fix the healthcare system.
How's your healthcare going these days? How's the transportation system going these days?
I don't really live here most time, but when I come back here, yeah, it's definitely not as it used to be. But I do have compassion for the people that are struggling. I do.
Why don't you want to do something about it?
I mean, I don't know. What are you supposed to do?
Redistribute that wealth, which is generated by all of us.
It's going to continue moving downwards until they keep taking more and more of the people's money that they make.
So if you just flip that logic on its head, it's how I see capitalism working. The money just keeps going up and up.
It does.
Up and up. It's wedged at the top.
There's some truth to that.
And 1 in 4 parents is skipping a meal to feed their
kids.
And food bank use has doubled since 2019.
There'll be a problem with the economy if a lot of rich people leave. A lot of business will leave. There'll be a lot of less towers that are empty. It's going to...
So then we could use them for housing. We desperately need more housing in this town.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and director of policy and engagement at the Broadbent Institute. What you just heard were two present and contrasting visions for Canadian equality. The first clip was from Prime Minister Mark Carney's much-applauded speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where, underneath the foreign policy pronouncements, while speaking to the billionaires in attendance at the annual affair, where business and governments rub shoulders, he highlighted tax cuts, AI, mining, and the fossil fuel industry as his key domestic policies. You also just heard from Avi Lewis, currently a candidate running for leadership of the federal New Democratic Party, who took to Bay Street to ask random folks working in Canada's financial centre what they thought about his policy commitment of implementing a wealth tax on the richest 1%. According to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, in 2025, a 1% wealth tax on the richest families would take in well over $22 billion annually. Meanwhile, the Carney government's cuts to public services announced as he first took office would total $21.5 billion. These are two competing visions for Canada's economy, and as consistent polling research shows, 90% of Canadians support a wealth tax. To be a part of the top 1% in Canada, the average income for an individual is about $300,000 annually, and the top 1% wealth threshold is about $7 million per family. It's pretty clear what the 99% think about a wealth tax, but what do the richest think? The group Patriotic Millionaires just released a survey of millionaires from across G20 member countries, and most millionaires seem to be on the same page as the 99%. According to this survey, 65% of millionaires polled support higher taxes on the very richest to invest in public services and tackle the cost of living crisis. Apparently, even most of the world's richest would be on board with a vision for society that ensured that the rich paid their fair share. So I asked the rich to tell us more about what they think about wealth taxes. Joining me today is Dylan Dussault, Executive Director of Patriotic Millionaires Canada. So first, let me clear the air. The name of your organization, Patriotic Millionaires, sounds kind of a bit funny to me. It's almost right-wing coded in that there's a sort of nationalism attached to being rich. It almost brings to mind for me the billionaires and oligarchs behind the U.S. Trump administration and MAGA and that whole movement. Could you tell us more about your organization and what you're really about?
Sure. So Patriotic Millionaires Canada is, I'll call it an intentionally slightly obnoxious name. It's really meant to grab the ears and grab attention. Who we are is we organize high net worth Canadians who are really concerned about the destabilizing impacts of wealth inequality on our economies, on our societies, on our democracies, and want to work collectively to address it, specifically through fixing our tax code, which is currently completely failing to tax the extremely wealthy, and continuing to grow wealth inequality at a higher and higher pace.
And so when we think about, the phrase tax the rich, it's been going around now since, I can remember its popularization under the Occupy Wall Street movement. And, we had this notion of the 99% versus the 1%. What do we mean, from your perspective, what do we mean when we say tax the rich? And what does that entail about what we need to do?
Sure. So when we say tax the rich, we are talking about a fairly specific group of high net worth people, right? So for our membership, we say you have to have $5 million in assets, right, to kind of fit our criteria for what we consider rich. The reason for that is around the point where you start getting a lot of tax advantages that other people don't have, right? You at that point can start making most of your income, say, from assets, buying and selling capital gains, borrowing against wealth, etc., as opposed to making most of your money from a paycheck. And that is really the fundamental flaw of the tax code we need to address if we're going to get serious about taxing the rich. It's the way we continue to value assets and say that they are somehow more beneficial, more important, more worthy of a tax cut than working for a living, right? If you make all of your money from buying and selling stocks, you only pay taxes on 50% of the money you make from that. If you make your money by, going into your service industry job every day, you're paying taxes on everything you make. And buying and selling stocks doesn't really do much of anything to stimulate our economy. It's kind of just helping make people who already own stocks richer, and like maybe paying some dividends out to some shareholders. Whereas people who are actually working for a living are kind of like the engines of our economy. And right now our tax code is valuing them much less. There's also, I would say, a second kind of tier of very, very wealthy people at the higher end who have so much money that they're not even like selling their capital gains. They are never creating realization events. They are never paying taxes. They are borrowing against their assets. They are going to banks and getting these very specially crafted personal loans on a floor of the bank you and I will probably never reach. That is, letting them pay 1, 2, 3% interest rates and live a very lavish lifestyle while claiming they're never making any income and allowing their wealth to continue to just expand untaxed indefinitely. And that's why we need to have something like a wealth tax, or something that effectively taxes that group that doesn't need to like realize their capital gains ever.
And so earlier this episode, before our interview, we aired a clip from Carney's speech at the World Economic Forum, where the world's richest attended and applauded his admission that liberalism was failing and his declaration of a foreign policy reorientation. But, he also made a number of statements on his own domestic economic priorities and policies. How should the wealthy feel about Carney's wealth tax policies?
Yeah, I mean, what I will say is Carney has no plan to tax wealth. In fact, like during that speech, he, waxed poetic about his own tax cuts, how they undid the attempt to reform capital gains tax that was started in the previous administration, or walked it back on the campaign trail, however we want to say it. How, they got rid of carbon taxes, they got rid of the digital services tax, they created more corporate tax breaks in their latest budget. And, he has this belief that this is what is going to like draw investment into this country, right? It's going to make it more appealing to foreign investment, is going to make it more appealing to be like an entrepreneur in this country, to start a business, to whatever. I think what the wealthy people involved in our group feel, what I feel is that's like a really fundamental misunderstanding of like what draws investment and what encourages entrepreneurship. If we think that our tax rate is gonna be what brings investment in this country, we are never gonna win a race to the bottom on corporate tax cuts with, say, the U.S., who obviously is kind of our most like obvious economic competitor. That is a endless pit of willingness to cut corporate taxes. So we need to think about what makes Canada like an attractive place to invest, what makes Canada an attractive place to start a business. That is a well-functioning healthcare system, which, by the way, in the US is like essentially the responsibility of employers. So that takes a pretty big chunk of change off your books. That is a really well-funded, high-quality education system. We have one of the most educated workforces in the world, if not the most. That helps, you find great employees for your business who are like prepared to do the work. That is being like an attractive place to live and raise a family, and build community, and want to start a business. And when entrepreneurs, for example, there's a lot of talk now about like we need to encourage entrepreneurship, we need to encourage innovation, and claims that like taxes are gonna kill all of that. If you are looking to start a business, pretty far down your list of concerns is like, hey, if this business really takes off and I become successful beyond my wildest dreams, and it becomes worth millions and millions and millions of dollars, am I gonna have to pay taxes on that? Like, no, your concern is like, are my kids going to still be able to go to good schools if I like quit my job and I do this? Are they going to be able to go see the doctors? Can we keep roofs over heads, food over our table? We need to stabilize people's economic lives so that they're able to take these risks, they're able to take these entrepreneurship experiences, they're able to have a little bit of a net to catch them, not be like, hey, if you happen to become insanely successful, we'll give you a really great tax cut. That's not like, it's just a misunderstanding of what motivates these people.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't see from Carney, this priority of making sure that people have the essentials and that, that it comes from rich people in Canada paying their fair share. And I mean, to contrast, we also heard earlier a clip from Avi Lewis talking to random Bay Street people about his proposal for a wealth tax on the 1%. You can imagine the reaction where many talk about capital flight, where the rich and their business, they threaten that they'll just move away to another low tax jurisdiction like the United States, where taxing wealth will just interfere with the economy is also what they argue. Though it's kind of interesting. You do hear that they are kind of sympathetic with the state of inequality and democracy, but they just don't seem to make that connection between their own wealth and the current state of affairs. And we also just saw this experience in New York City, where U.S. millionaires and billionaires have threatened to leave under a Zoran Mamdani mayorship. Still remains to be seen. But speaking for the millionaires and billionaires, are these threats that were stated in the video interview that Avi Lewis did, are those threats real?
Yeah, I mean, this is a constant refrain, and I'll address it in a few different points. One, and maybe the most obvious, is a really, really nice perk of being very, very wealthy is you get to live wherever you want without your finances being a consideration. So, like, think of some reasons you might want to live in Canada if you're a centimillionaire, a billionaire, whatever. We went through some of them earlier. You have a highly educated workforce. There's a great education system for your kids. There's a stable consumer base. There's a stable banking system, the healthcare system you're not responsible for, etc. And then there's the non-tangibles. There's your friends, your families, your community. Maybe you live in BC and you love to hike or ski, or you live on the East Coast and you love to stare at the ocean slamming against rocks. Or, you live in a big city and you love concerts and museums and your favorite hockey team, whatever it is. Regardless, if you're one of these people who've made like more wealth than you can reasonably spend in a lifetime, and probably more than your children will be able to spend, or you can't even outspend the growth of it anymore, right? Things like changes to capital gains, wealth taxes, etc. They're not going to impact your lifestyle. They're not going to impact your bottom line in any way. It might slightly slow the growth of your already astronomical wealth. But if you're a person who is willing to uproot your entire life, your family's life, your business, what have you, and leave over a slight slowing of your astronomical wealth, you are definitely on like the fringes. And there aren't enough of you to make a difference. So then the concern becomes, okay, maybe they're not actually going to leave, but they're going to move their assets to a lower tax country, right? So first off, plenty of them are already doing that. You had Jared Walker from Canadians for Tax Fairness on this podcast a few months back talking about, the abuse of tax havens by Canadians, which has become substantial and is sucking billions out of the economy annually. But secondly, we have an exit tax in Canada, and it's a pretty good one. If they want to pull their assets out, they're going to have to pay fair market value on all of those assets as if they had sold them. That is a hell of a lot more money than they are going to be paying over the lifetime of a wealth tax, likely. So if they're willing to take a huge financial hit, a huge personal hit, to make some sort of belligerent point about why they should not be reinvesting in the public systems that help make them rich, I say, like, sayonara, off you go. So I guess the question is, like, why do they keep claiming they're going to do this? It's because the threat works, right? It scares government leaders. It scares the general public who believes they're going to like lose jobs, or that the Canadian government is going to go broke, and we desperately need to cater to the whims of the wealthiest people in the country to avoid that. And so I think a big part of like our mission in this needs to be calling that bluff, right? We helped make these people rich. They relied on our infrastructure. They relied on, our workforce and our consumer base and the healthcare system and the education system. I keep talking about these things, but it's true. All of that to get wealthy. And taxes are not like a punishment. Taxes are a reflection saying, hey, you have benefited the most from this system. You benefited more from anybody else that uses this system. You should be paying more back into it. And the people who are hoarding wealth, who are not reinvesting in our public systems, and who are so offended at the fact that you being suggests that they do so, that they're going to like pick up their ball and go home, like they're not, or actually go away from home in this case, they're not adding value to our economy anyways. And I think we saw like a really real example of this in Norway recently. They marginally increased their wealth tax. There was this like relentless press and media effort claiming, all of the rich people are going to leave. This is going to destroy the economy, yada, yada, yada. 236,000 millionaires and billionaires in Norway. A total of 30 of them actually followed through with the left. It's like 1/100th of a percent of their wealthy population. There was like an academic study on what would need it to happen to actually create any kind of like significant economic impact or cost to the economy. It would need to be about 15 times larger than it actually was. And the tax base that left was nothing compared to the revenue they brought in from this tax. So that's a long-winded answer, but my general short answer is I don't buy this threat.
Yeah, I mean, if they're unfounded threats and that, it scares governments, you kind of have to think, are they really that scared, or are they just playing scared when, the world's richest make these threats? And then, I mean, you did just ask the world's richest what they actually think about things like wealth taxes. So Patriotic Millionaires just released a survey of millionaires from across G20 member countries and polled their feelings on wealth taxes. Can you talk more about the survey? I mean, of interest to me up front, your first question here is, over the last decade, the richest people in the world have seen their wealth increase drastically. Some argue that this gives these individuals significant power over global politics compared to working people. Others argue that wealthy individuals do not have more influence on politics than members of the public. Which of the following statements is closest to your view, whether or not extreme wealth concentration is a threat or not a threat to democracy. That finding was interesting to me because 62% of millionaires around the world agree that extreme wealth is a threat to democracy. And so, why is behind that sentiment? How is also extreme wealth exactly a threat to democracy?
That's a great question, and I think you can kind of see it in some of the what I would almost call like sub questions below that, right? 81% said that extremely wealthy individuals can buy access to politicians. 77% said that they use it to buy political influence. 6 and 10 think extreme wealth is harmful to a factional media and social trust. 71% thinks that they can use it to influence election outcomes. And 69% said that they believe it is preventing action on tackling inequality, right? So, I mean, that tells you some of it. There are, countries in the G20 that have like more straightforward kind of like pay to play political systems, right? Where there are not like reasonable campaign finance restrictions, and they're just dumping hundreds of millions of dollars into election cycles. And then there's these kind of more underhanded ways that the rich are able to influence our politics. They are buying media companies, they are buying social media outlets, they are funding think tanks, including sometimes like out of universities, that create these kind of very credible looking reports that say, well, the government can't do anything that would in any way impact the personal wealth of the 0.01% because XXX trickle down factor, paid for by the 0.01%. And it limits what I would say is considered like the quote unquote serious policy discussions, right? It creates this the Overton window is maybe like an overused phrase, but it's a real one of like what is kind of acceptable to discuss, and it pushes ideas that would actually have impact on these extreme levels of wealth inequality, like to the fringe sometimes. And that's that kind of like subversive influence on politics people have, as well as just like these personal ties, etc. Right? It's easier for people who like have wealth to decide like, hey, I'm gonna like run for public office and I'm gonna like do all these things, right? And so they just like their personal network, their lived experience can sometimes be different. And so it creates this kind of like self-fulfilling prophecy of like what is the acceptable policy discussion, what are the parameters of that, and they get more and more narrow and move closer and closer together.
I mean, that makes sense. I mean, look at the U.S. Trump administration and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and his business dealings before at the World Economic Forum. You saw what the business community as government really thinks. And I mean, you have Prime Minister Mark Carney himself also, coming from this background in finance after being governors of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England. It's pretty clear that this rich business class is also very well embedded in politics, if not in relationship with policymakers. And then, like you said, the rich can live basically anywhere they want. So they level these threats at governments. And so, to me, it sounds like a wealth tax itself in Canada, even though it seems like a domestic issue, is definitely also an international issue. And back to Carney and his international interventions, before his time as prime minister, we didn't really pay attention much to it in Canada, but at the G20 in Brazil in 2024, you had Brazilian finance minister Fernando Haddad pushing to coordinate countries on taxing the rich. And your survey shows support for this question, that the presidents of South Africa, Brazil, and Spain have suggested setting up a new international panel on inequality that would bring together the world's experts to show its scale, its causes, and concrete policies to address it. To what extent do you support or oppose this idea? And then we see that most do indeed support this idea. Most millionaires do. And Canada kind of has sat on the sidelines of this issue. Could you tell us more about what this initiative is all about and what this should mean for Prime Minister Mark Carney's government?
Yeah, I would say that the G20 in Rio was a really interesting exercise in what like being a host country can do to influence the agenda, right? The Brazilian government wanted to put this on the agenda. They were working with Gabriel Zuckman, who's a fairly well-known French economist who does a lot of work on wealth taxes, on sort of a presentation to the G20 leadership group and the finance ministers on how you could structure sort of a global agreement to tax billionaire wealth. It's like loosely modeled over after what the OECD did on corporate taxes a few years back when they agreed to like set this sort of minimum international corporate tax to help kind of combat this country shopping that corporations were doing to stash their profits in lower tax countries. There's been some drama on actually implementing that, but there was sort of a historic agreement to do that. What they were suggesting was a similar model on taxing billionaire wealth. So if the G20 countries could get together and they could say, you go to your country, you deal with the laws that exist there, you structure the tax system however you want. It can be an individual tax, it can be a combination of things, but achieve essentially a 2% tax on billionaire wealth, meet that standard. Every country meets that standard, and then you get rid of even the concept of billionaire wealth play, right? And so that was the discussion they were having at that conference. At the end of that G20, there was like a communique written that had a sort of nod to like, hey, we do need to work collectively on how we tax extreme wealth and how we fight tax evasion, which was like a pretty big deal. Actually, it was the first time they had said anything like that, even if it was not super specific. Since then, not that much has been done. And I think not that much has been done in Canada. I think there is a problem where like wealth inequality has kind of moved off of the agenda as like a actual problem that needs to be addressed, right? There's a lot of like, let's try to address some of the symptoms of it instead of the disease itself. And so I think that has been an issue. This conference, basically like this being suggested by Spain and Brazil and South Africa, the idea behind it is like, let's get some of the leading thinkers together from around the world. Let's get like institutional support from countries that are in the G20. Let's work collectively to create kind of a set of policy proposals for G20 countries about how to combat these like extreme levels of inequality, which are growing in every single G20 country, right? Canada is seeing exploding wealth inequality. We're not like particularly unique in that way. The gap between the rich and poor everywhere is getting larger. And so how do we address that before it gets to the point where it's completely destabilized these economies and our democracies are completely under capture of the wealthy? Which to me seems like a pretty noble thing. And I think, Canada should certainly be throwing its weight behind it. There is a leadership vacuum, as Carney identified with his speech about the collapse of the world order right now, right? And I think these countries need to like step up on these priorities and say, we are going to like participate in this. We are going to be leaders of this. We are going to do what we can to implement as many of these recommendations as possible and be a model for the world, essentially.
Wrapping up here, where can people find more work from Patriotic Millionaires Canada, and what's next for your organization?
Yeah, you can find us at patrioticmillionaires.ca. Like I said, we just launched this big annual letter and survey. We are going to continue being like loud and proud public advocates for a more equal society and a more progressive tax code. You will see us doing more media. There's like a couple of cool op-eds we just put out. We're going to be doing like some events in Ottawa this year, I think. Continuing to kind of like create pressure, and frankly, undercut some of the arguments from some of these like highly wealthy people in this country who claim they are speaking in the best interest of the Canadian economy and not in the best interest of their personal pocketbooks. There's a lot of very, very loud wealthy people in this country who are screaming and doing everything they can to protect their own wealth. I think what you see in this survey we just did is they are actually in the minority of even quite rich people. And so, I think like it needs to be clear this is not a monolith, this group that is just like not engaged in long-term thinking, not, willing to be people who are willing to be really rich people in poor countries are actually pretty rare. Most people want to live in a country where everyone's able to live with dignity and feed themselves and their families and keep a roof over their head and have a good, thriving life. And like you can still be really rich in that world, by the way. There's nothing stopping that, and these people will continue to be more than fine if we raise their taxes.
Dylan, thank you for this insightful and timely discussion with me on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
That was Dylan Dussault, Executive Director of Patriotic Millionaires Canada. If you like this interview, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca, and get more from the Broadbent Institute by subscribing to our mailing list at broadbentinstitute.ca/subscribe.